All right, so as we said at the top of the show, this being our last show of 2023, we decided that instead of picking, say, the 5 most consequential stories or events we think took place in 2023, and I talked about the 3 stories I thought were most important at the top of the show: the censorship regime being implemented, the attempt to keep Trump off the ballot to put him in jail, and the Israel-Gaza war. We decided instead to focus on the shows that we did, the 5 shows that we did that covered 5 issues that we think were the most under-discussed. So I just want to go through those quickly for you. If you are a new viewer, if you haven't watched these are the ones that we think really deserve a lot more attention. There's a lot of original reporting in them, and we think they tie into a whole bunch of other things. We all put together a long list, and we kind of debated, and we picked these 5 as the ones that we think were the ones that deserve a lot more attention. So here on May 22nd of this year, we produced a show that was entitled Mystery of the 2001 Anthrax Attacks and the Links to the COVID Debate. And we covered the extremely confounding narrative about what happened with the anthrax attacks in the United States in 2001, just a couple of weeks after the 9/11 attacks, which were instantly blamed on Iraq. We discussed the FBI's official narrative about who perpetrated the anthrax attack and the gigantic holes that it has in it. But ultimately, the FBI's narrative is that a U.S. Army scientist named Bruce Ivins, working in a U.S. Army facility in Fort Detrick, was weaponizing very sophisticated strains of anthrax that could be used in an offensive biological attack. And that he was the one who attacked the United States, that the attack came from a U.S. Army lab, says the FBI. And one of the things that we wanted to do, in addition to making people aware of how significant that story was and how many holes there are in its explanation, is to understand the connection that it has to COVID, by proving that the United States and China do in fact do the sorts of highly dangerous gain-of-function research and manipulation of biological agents that Anthony Fauci vehemently denied that he was actually doing, to demonstrate that we still don't have answers on the COVID attack, on the COVID epidemic. Where that strain came from, how it emerged, the way in which debate was shut down in the United States. Scientists with no evidence early on, including ones who said they were sure that it came from a lab, and then were told by Fauci to change, signed a letter in the Lancet, calling anything other than the story about a natural origin to be a grotesque conspiracy theory and an attack on the Chinese scientists who they regard with such integrity. People were censored by big tech for trying to have this debate. And then the lie got too big. The United States government admitted it didn't know the origin of the story, but there's so much light to be shined on it by what happened with these anthrax attacks in the United States and the major role those anthrax attacks played in elevating the fears that led to all the aggressive reaction by the United States all throughout the Muslim world that became the war on terror, including the invasion of Iraq. And when you really break down that anthrax attack and what the United States government said about it at the time and where it came from and why, it really undercuts a lot of the claims about the COVID narrative. So we wanted to cover that. For those who prefer to read about it, in June of 2021, I actually wrote an article on Substack about all the reporting I've done over the years on this issue. It was entitled The FBI's Strange Anthrax Investigation and How It Sheds Light onto the COVID Lab Leak Theory and Fauci's emails. Remember, there were all those emails released from Dr. Fauci proving that so much of what he said and did at the start of the pandemic turned out to be utter lies. And while that got some attention, I don't even think it got near enough. The relationship of anthrax and what that investigation reveals, just as a standalone important story, and the light that it shines on this COVID mystery, I think, has never gotten anywhere near the attention it deserved. Here was, on June 13th, a story that we did a lot of original reporting on, and we found this actually kind of stunning which was a new report that was prepared by the CIA and Homeland Security and then obtained by the Senate about the fact that U.S. intelligence agencies purchase enormous amounts of data about you personally that they would be prohibited from collecting about you by the Constitution. Here was the report that we reported on. It was from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Senior Advisory Group, a panel on commercially available information. And one of the things that happens is that Facebook and Google and all kinds of firms collect massive amounts of invasive data about who you are as a person and what you do online. And then they sell it. And there are programs inside the CIA and the Director of National Intelligence Office to buy this information about American citizens. So they're keeping gigantic sweeping dossiers on very private information about American citizens that they themselves admitted in this report they have no legal basis to collect directly. But by buying it, using your tax money to buy dossiers on you, they are able to gather enormous amounts of information about the American population. We've talked about this before, that in an ideal democracy, we would know everything that our government was doing. That's why they're called the public sector. With very rare exception when they have to hide what they're doing for some legitimate reason. By and large, we're supposed to know about what they're doing. With public power, there's supposed to be transparency. Conversely, they're supposed to know very little about what we're doing. We're private citizens. We have a private realm that surrounds us. And yet, in the United States, that has been completely reversed. We know very little about what the U.S. government does because so much of what they do is conducted behind a wall of secrecy through an abuse of classified powers. I talked about how when I reported on the Snowden archive and the hundreds of thousands, if not more, top secret documents I read through, so many of them were actually banal, just ordinary documents that should never have been classified. But in Washington, everything is automatically classified, reflexively classified, and kept from the population. So we know very little about what they do, and they know enormous amounts about us, the population, through programs like this. And we thought that was an incredibly important story, both on its own right, but also in terms of what it reflects about how this dynamic has been perverted, how it's been reversed, and the extent to which they're spying on the United States. Now, the next story, obviously we spent a lot of time covering the Twitter files and the revelations of it. We had on Matt Taibbi and almost every other reporter who did that reporting. We spent many shows discussing the implications of what it meant that the CIA and the FBI and Homeland Security were constantly calling and in contact with Twitter, Facebook, and Google and successfully demanding the censorship of all kinds of political speech. But the thing we want to focus on here that we don't think got enough attention because of how significant it is that when there was a congressional hearing, finally, on the Twitter files, and Matt Taibbi showed up with Michael Schellenberger to talk about the reporting they did, the Democrats on this committee, and we had been saying for so long that this was the case, but they made it so explicitly clear, the Democrats on this committee did not deny that the CIA and the FBI and Homeland Security were trying to censor the internet. Instead, they defended it. Every one of the members of the Democratic members of this committee, before which Taibbi and Schellenberger appeared, rose in defense of the CIA and Homeland Security. And it shows how the Democratic Party has really become, and polling data shows this, a party that reveres the U.S. security state, sees them as a political ally, and shows the extent to which these agencies are interfering in our politics. I don't think these Democratic Party members have any concept of the history of the CIA and the FBI and the abuses it committed and the way in which the liberal left of the United States had, almost by reflex, has always hated these agencies and been highly suspicious of them and opposed to their abuse of power for domestic ends. But the Democratic Party has none of that in it. All the skepticism of the U.S. security state exists on the populist wing of the Republican Party. There's plenty of Republican established politicians who are with the Democrats and loving these agencies. That's why the FBI's spying powers just got renewed in a bipartisan vote that we reported on last week. But to the extent there's any skepticism at all, it's in the populist wing of the Republican Party and almost none in the Democratic Party. Here was Colin Allred in one of the most extraordinary videos I've seen this year. A Democrat from Texas explicitly telling Matt Taibbi that not only should he not be concerned about CIA and FBI and Homeland Security censorship of the internet, he should be grateful for it. Listen to what he said.
We live in an information age where malign actors do want to use social media to influence our elections, both big, the ones that you've spent a lot of time talking about, and small, like mine.
Mr. Congressman,
and it should be a bipartisan goal. No, you don't get to ask questions here.
Okay.
It should be a bipartisan goal to ensure that Americans and only Americans determine the outcome of our elections, not fear-mongering. And I hope that you can actually take this with you, because I honestly hope that you will grapple with this. That it may be possible that if we can take off the tinfoil hat, that there's not a vast conspiracy, but that ordinary folks and national security agencies responsible for our security are trying their best to find a way to make sure that our online discourse doesn't get people hurt or see our democracy undermined. And that the very rights that you think they're trying to undermine, they may be trying to protect.
So the CIA and the FBI and Homeland Security, when they're telling big tech companies what they can and cannot allow to be said, are just trying to protect our democracy. They're censoring for our own good. Big Brother loves us, says the Democratic Party. That is the position of the Democratic Party, stated so beautifully and so clearly. Up until maybe like 7 years ago, if you were a Democratic Party member of Congress and you stood up to say that the CIA and the FBI and DHS are filled with good, kind, benevolent people who are censoring our political speech for our own good to protect our democracy, you would be laughed at. Now, none of them laugh at it. They all think that way, every last one of them. There has not been a member of the Democratic Party who has expressed any serious concern or doubt about the right of the FBI or the CIA or the NSA to engage in online censorship in this manner. Remember that that program that he just defended was declared unconstitutional. In fact, one of the gravest attacks on the First Amendment, first by a federal district court judge and then by an appellate court judge ruling, a three-judge appellate court ruling, that said it's one of the gravest attacks on the First Amendment right to free speech that the Biden administration, the FBI, and various agencies within it have been systematically not just requesting, but demanding and coercing censorship of Americans' political speech by big tech. The reaction of the Democratic Party to that was, this is a good thing. We should be grateful for them. Just like they think it's a vindication of democracy to kick Donald Trump off the ballot, they're willing to say it's a vindication of democracy and a protection of democracy to have these U.S. security state agencies censor our political speech. That is the view of the Democratic Party. That was the reason why the Twitter files, remember, not only didn't get attention, but were affirmatively mocked by most members of the corporate media who told people to ignore it because it was a nothing burger, only for federal court judges to unanimously say that it revealed a grave attack on the First Amendment. They didn't just say ignore it, they said be grateful for it. That is the view of the Democratic Party. They are the party that wants the CIA and the FBI and the U.S. security state interfering in and controlling and governing not just our politics, but our political speech. And that has been something that shift in the Democratic Party's posture toward the U.S. security state has gotten nowhere near enough attention. Now, here is our fourth story that we think needed more attention, which we, again, this is our original reporting that we presented on May 19th, the title of which was Bellingcat, the shady mouthpiece of elites. Bellingcat has become one of the favorite independent media outlets, in quotes, of corporate media outlets in the U.S. government, and for good reason, because they are funded by arms of the United States government that are adjacent to the CIA. And so much of what they do is designed to promote the agenda of the U.S. security state, of whatever wars the U.S. security state are fighting. And out of nowhere, they got presented as these scrappy, independent journalists who, through open source work, reveal all these kind of truths that the mainstream media doesn't report. And yet, when you look at who they are and who their funding is, you see that their funding comes from the very Western security agencies whose agenda, with few exceptions, they dutifully serve. This is the same thing that you find when you look underneath the hood of disinformation organizations and disinformation experts, the people trying to censor the internet. Wherever you look, you find the hidden hand of these security state agencies, and the fact that the corporate media decided to take Bellingcat and venerate it, hold it up as an example of trustworthy independent media, when in fact they see the world through the prism of their benefactors. That's why those are their benefactors. The CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy and Western European governments don't fund media outlets that report on things that undermine their agenda. They report on things that promote and advance it. That's what Bellingcat is. Of course, it got very little attention, who they are and where their funding comes from, because they become a creature of the corporate media, which has the same allegiances. So it's not that this story is some blockbuster, groundbreaking report in and of itself. What matters about it is what it illustrates about who controls the flow of information, what the real allegiance of the corporate media of the United States is. And then finally, on June 26th, we published a show, the title of which was The West War on Dissent, on the right to dissent. And what we did in this show, principally, was at the time, there was a lot of calls by Democrats for Jack Smith to indict President Trump on the crime of inciting an insurrection. And the theory they wanted to use was that the political speech that Trump gave on January 6th to that assembled crowd was outside of the bounds of the First Amendment. It wasn't protected speech because he was trying to incite violent or lawless action, even though the only comment he made about whether violence should be used is when he told them to march to the Capitol peacefully. We showed you all of that this week when we reported on the decision by the Colorado Supreme Court, when we broke it down and dissected it. But when Jack Smith unveiled his indictment of Donald Trump, and it did not contain a charge of inciting an insurrection, and it did not try to use Trump's January 6th speech as a basis for criminality, we were very relieved, because what we did in this show was we took the key precedents of the U.S. Supreme Court in the latter part of the 20th century, particularly Brandenburg versus Ohio and Claiborne versus the NAACP, to show you what the Supreme Court has said on the outer bounds of free speech and why those key seminal cases would be so endangered if there was any attempt to indict Trump as an insurrectionist. And yet, amazingly, this week, when the Colorado Supreme Court, by a 4-3 ruling, went to bar Trump from appearing on the California Republican primary ballot, the theory they invoked was that he was an insurrectionist based on that January 6th speech, even though he's never been charged with it. And we touched on the reasons why that is such a threatening theory to core First Amendment freedoms. But if you really want to hear about Brandenburg and Claiborne and what it did, those seminal cases, in creating such robust protections for free speech rights of Americans, one of the best things about our country, this is the show that we recommend that you watch. And it doesn't just walk you through that case law, but also makes very clear, and we obviously didn't know at the time that this Colorado case was coming, why that Colorado case is such a full frontal attack on free speech rights of the United States. So those are the 5 stories we picked as ones that we think merit greater attention. There's obviously commonalities and through lines with a lot of the reporting that we do here that is about the way in which free speech rights and core civil liberties are being eroded and under attack by neoliberal institutions. But some of these stories, like the standalone story about anthrax and COVID and Dr. Fauci, I think merit attention unto themselves. Obviously, we spent a lot of time this year covering the war in Ukraine at the beginning, and now the war in Israel at the end, but there's a lot going on that we think does not get covered by the mainstream media. And one of the reasons we love doing this show and want to continue to do it is because it gives us an opportunity to cover these stories that we think would receive very little attention in most mainstream venues unless we were and other shows were covering it. That to me is what independent media is for. Not to tell you what you want to hear, not to become a place for partisan organizing, but to take the flaws of the corporate media and the things they deceive on and correct them, and the things they ignore and shine a light on them. And that's what we think these 5 stories did this year. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.